It was the Christmas season of 1959 when the Walker family, a happy family of 4, went out to run some errands. Christine, the caring mother, decided to come home early to cook a warm dinner for her family while they were still out. But as soon as she stepped inside, she was met with an unknown intruder. This intruder went on to abuse Christine and then shot her, leading to her tragic death. Moments later, her husband Cliff arrived home with their little ones, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie. What should have been a joyful reunion quickly turned into a nightmare. Cliff was ambushed and shot without warning, leaving the innocent children defenseless. Jimmy was shot next, and it was reported that he crawled to his father as the killer fired bullet after bullet into his head. Little Debbie faced an even more horrific fate. After being shot, she was drowned in the family bathtub. This case remains unsolved to this day, but thanks to new technology, we might finally be getting closer to uncovering what really happened to the Walker family. Interestingly, this mystery is also linked to another well-known crime from the same year, a case that shaped the true crime genre as we know it. So, if you're curious about who might be responsible for this horrific tragedy, let's dig in and find out more. The story of the Walker family begins in the quiet town of Osprey, located in Sarasota County, Florida. With a population of just over 6,000 people, Osprey was a small, peaceful place where everyone seemed to know each other. Cliff Walker and Christine first met at Arcadia High School, where their personalities couldn't have seemed more different yet fit together perfectly. Cliff was a tall, wiry cowboy known for his love of cool cigarettes. He rarely drank, but his friends could always count on him to be hardworking and dependable. Christine, on the other hand, was full of energy and charm. With her curly light brown hair and bright smile, she was the outgoing, flirty drum major who turned heads wherever she went. And despite having many admirers, Christine fell for Cliff, and the two quickly became inseparable. They married young, with Christine at 19 and Cliff at 20. In the 5 years that followed, their family grew, welcoming 2 children, Jimmy and Debbie, into their lives. Life was simple but joyful for the Walkers. They lived in a small white wood frame house nestled at the end of a winding shell road on Potter Palmer Ranch, a massive property spanning over 14,000 acres. Cliff worked on the ranch as a cow handler, a tough but rewarding job. Their house was modest, but felt warm and welcoming, and the Walkers made it a loving home. The ranch was far from crowded, with their closest neighbors living a full mile away, giving them a quiet space to raise their little ones. Though Cliff made a steady income as a ranch hand, they weren't as financially comfortable as some of their friends and family. Money wasn't plentiful, but the Walkers valued the simple joys: quiet evenings, shared meals, and watching their 2 young children grow. Now, life on the ranch meant early mornings for the Walker family. Most days, the home would already be stirring with activity at dawn, as Cliff would prepare for a long day's work and Christine managed the busy mornings with the children. That's why, when a family friend named Don McCall arrived at their house early on the morning of December 20th, 1959, he expected to find the Walkers up and about, maybe even getting ready for a busy day ahead. But instead, he was met with an unsettling silence. Thinking maybe Cliff had just overslept, Don knocked loudly on the back door. When no one answered, he tried again, each knock a little louder than the last. By the time he'd knocked several times with no response, worry began to set in. Finally, feeling something was truly wrong, Don made a difficult choice to cut the screen door, unhook the latch, and enter the silent home. Stepping into the dark kitchen, he switched on the light, hoping he'd find a simple explanation for the strange stillness. But what Don saw next was beyond anything he could have imagined. Just inside the doorway to the living room, he spotted Christine's feet. She was barefoot, lying on the floor, her dress pulled up around her waist. Christine, just 24 years old, had been killed by a gunshot to the head, a wound inflicted by a .22 caliber weapon. As Don looked further into the room, his heart sank even more. Cliff was lying on his back, still wearing his cowboy hat. Next to him was their little son, 3-year-old Jimmy, lying close to his dad. Both had been shot in the head with the same weapon. The blood on the floor showed that Jimmy had crawled toward his father, possibly trying to seek comfort in his last moments. Debbie, the Walkers' 2-year-old daughter, was missing from where the rest of her family lay. Alarmed and horrified, he ran out of the house, jumped in his car, and drove a mile to the nearest payphone to call the police. Investigators arrived quickly, and as they searched the house, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Debbie was in the bathroom, lying in the bathtub. She had suffered a gunshot wound, but her actual cause of death was drowning. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, when this tragic murder took place, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office faced an uphill battle. They had no suspects to go on, so they combed through the house, searching for any clues that might reveal who was behind this horrific crime. However, the sheriff's office was small, underfunded, and didn't have enough resources to properly handle such a complex case. As a result, mistakes were made right from the start. Deputies from nearby counties came to help, bringing along bloodhounds, fingerprint experts, and ballistics specialists. Yet, despite this extra assistance, there were still major obstacles. Sarasota County didn't even have a camera to capture the scene, so news photographers had to be brought in to take crime scene photos, a crucial task usually reserved for investigators to prevent contamination. The presence of so many people coming and going likely disturbed key evidence. For instance, any tire tracks from unfamiliar vehicles could have been destroyed by all the extra activity near the property. However, investigators did find some chilling details connected to the murder. It seemed that Christine was the attacker's first victim, and she put up a fierce fight. She had used her high-heeled shoe to defend herself, leaving traces of her attacker's blood on it. But even with her efforts, the intruder overpowered her, assaulted her, and took her life. Strangely, it looked as though her body had been moved and arranged in the living room afterward, almost as if staged by the killer. While combing through the scene, investigators also found unknown DNA evidence on Christine's clothing, a potential clue pointing to the attacker's identity. And fortunately enough, no similar signs of assault or struggle were found on the other family members. Additionally, several strange items were missing from the Walkers' home after the tragedy: Cliff's pocket knife, Christine's old high school majorette uniform, and even their marriage license. These weren't items a typical burglar would think to take, so police felt they could be clues. They also found disturbing signs left behind, and those are a bloody cowboy boot print on the floor, a partial fingerprint on the bathtub, some spent bullet casings believed to be from the murder weapon, and a cigarette wrapper of a brand no one in the Walker family smoked. In an odd twist, months after the murders, 3 local women stumbled across a pile of bloody clothing in a nearby shed. Among the items were 2 shirts, a skirt, a blouse, pants, and a handkerchief, all belonging to Cliff and Christine. Investigators believed the killer had used these clothes to wipe off blood before leaving the scene. All these clues led detectives to believe that the killer might have been someone familiar to the Walkers. For one, Christine hadn't parked in her usual spot in the driveway that day, hinting that someone else might have already been there. Even more unsettling was that the family's 3 dogs hadn't barked at the intruder. These dogs usually barked at anyone unfamiliar, so their silence suggested that whoever came into the Walker home that day wasn't a stranger to them. And to really understand why Christine was the first victim, investigators interviewed friends and family, gathering details about the Walkers' last day on December 19, 1959. This was just 6 days before Christmas, so the family of 4 headed out around 4 in the afternoon to run a few errands. They picked up cigarettes, sodas, candy, and cattle feed. Christine drove home in the family's 1952 Plymouth, arriving about 30 minutes before Cliff and the kids, who came later in his Jeep. Cliff had been considering a trade for a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air with a green and white two-tone finish. And it's possible he was out checking on cars that day. It's possible that's why he and Christine were separated, allowing her to get home just a bit before him. Christine barely had time to hang her purse and put away the groceries before she was ambushed. Police believe that Cliff and the children arrived while the killer was still there, catching them off guard, and that's why they too became victims. One of the biggest challenges for the investigation was that there were simply too many suspects. Detectives interviewed an overwhelming 587 people, which made it hard to narrow down who, if anyone, had a real connection to the murders. And after diving deep into the investigation and examining all the suspects, we've put together a list of the most intriguing names without any particular order. Starting with Curtis McCall, at the time of these tragic events, Curtis was just 21 years old and had a past with Christine Walker. They had dated back in high school, and rumors suggested that they might have rekindled their relationship shortly before her death. This connection immediately made him a person of interest in the case. What stood out about Curtis was that he owned a .22 caliber pistol, the very same type of weapon used in the murders. Interestingly, locals also painted him as a troublemaker, describing him as a no-good sort of guy who was always stirring up trouble. And according to rumors, after the murders, Curtis's demeanor changed noticeably. He became extremely anxious and lost a lot of weight, leading many to wonder if the weight of his actions was starting to catch up with him. It's also important to point out that Curtis had a history of violence. In fact, he had been fired from his job as a dispatcher for the Florida Highway Patrol after an incident where he attacked a man during a traffic stop. His fellow officers had to step in to prevent the situation from escalating, and surprisingly, Curtis didn't even remember what had happened. The investigation led authorities to track Curtis down to the Sumner County Courthouse in Georgia, where he was working as a construction foreman at the time. During questioning, he claimed he and Christine were never involved romantically, but he did recall seeing her a few weeks before the murders. Christine and her husband Cliff had stopped by his place to ask about a horse he was selling. This detail seemed innocent enough, but it showed he was still connected to the couple. When questioned about his .22 caliber pistol, Curtis admitted he once owned one but insisted that he had sold it to someone, although he couldn't recall who that was. This inconsistency raised more eyebrows among investigators, and to get to the bottom of things, he underwent a polygraph test to determine his honesty. Initially, he appeared nervous, which could suggest he had something to hide. However, in subsequent tests, he seemed more at ease, and the results indicated that he was telling the truth about most of his statements. But there was a catch. When asked if he withheld any information during the questioning, the polygraph results were less clear. It suggested that he might not have been entirely truthful about certain details, leaving investigators wondering what he might be hiding. And as of today, no one knew if Curtis was still alive or what had happened to him. Next is Wilbur Tooker. Tooker was a 65-year-old retired railroad worker who lived just a mile southwest of the Walkers. He was once a familiar face in their home, dropping by often to chat and share stories. But his visits took a troubling turn as his behavior became more inappropriate, creating tension and discomfort within the family. It was reported that Christine Walker found herself increasingly uneasy around Tooker. She confided in her mother about her fears, expressing how much she dreaded being near him. This was not just a passing concern. It was a deep-rooted fear that Tooker might cross boundaries that no one should ever cross. Several family members and friends later recalled incidents where Tooker had tried to kiss Christine or even coax her into bed. His actions were persistent enough that Christine felt she had to tell her husband, Cliff, about them. So, obviously, Cliff was furious when he heard what Tooker had been doing. He wanted to confront the older man and put an end to it. But Christine, worried about potential trouble, persuaded him to hold back. Even so, Cliff made it clear to Tooker that he was no longer welcome in their home and warned him not to come around anymore. Unfortunately, That warning seemed to fall on deaf ears. In the aftermath of the Walker family's tragic fate, Tooker's behavior raised even more suspicions. His friend William Hosmer revealed that Tooker was angry with Christine after her death, constantly talking about her in a way that made others uncomfortable. This strange obsession only added to the unsettling nature of Tooker's character. He often visited the Walker home, claiming he was gathering evidence to protect himself, which only fueled the investigation into his actions. On the day of the murders, detectives retraced Tooker's movements. He had gone out to dinner with a friend from around 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., but there was a significant gap in his timeline. Between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m., just when the Walkers were brutally murdered, Tooker had no solid alibi. After dinner, he showed up at Bradenton High School by 7:45 p.m. to play the violin with the school orchestra. Investigators spoke with his fellow musicians to see if they noticed anything strange about Tooker that evening, but no one could confirm any odd behavior. Sadly, Tooker passed away in March 1963, leaving behind a trail of questions and an unsettling feeling surrounding the Walker family's tragic fate. Then we have Elbert Walker, who happened to be Cliff's cousin. From the very beginning, Elbert's reaction to the tragic death of the Walker family raised eyebrows. At the funeral, he didn't just shed a few tears, he wailed loudly, almost as if he were putting on a performance. It got so intense that he fainted and had to be carried out of the service. This dramatic display left many family members feeling uneasy, leading them to suspect that Elbert was simply faking his grief for attention. Some even told investigators that he was putting on a show to draw focus to himself. Elbert had a reputation for being wild, especially when he drank. Family members whispered that he secretly had feelings for Christine, which made his behavior all the more suspicious. After the funeral, his actions only added fuel to the fire of suspicion. Whenever anyone mentioned the crime, Elbert would suddenly leave the room, refusing to engage in conversations about the tragedy that had befallen his family. Growing up, Elbert and Cliff were close. In fact, Elbert had even lived with the Walker family for a time after separating from the military, which made his sudden withdrawal from discussions about the murders seem all the more troubling. When investigators decided to question Elbert, he cooperated fully, undergoing a polygraph test, which he passed. However, on the day the bodies were discovered, Elbert claimed he had come to Osprey from Wauchula to discuss a Christmas party that Cliff was supposedly planning. Investigators later learned this story was untrue, as Cliff had not planned any party and was actually going to Arcadia for the holidays. When Elbert arrived in Osprey that day, he dropped off a friend at the Ohio bar before heading to a nearby gas station, where he approached two men. One of the men noticed that Elbert's eyes were red and thought he looked like he had a rough night. Elbert asked, "Do you know where Cliff Walker lives?" This question struck them as strange because Elbert had lived at the Walker's house for months after leaving the military in 1958. He was familiar with the area and had attended many family cookouts and gatherings. One of the men at the gas station eventually told Elbert the heartbreaking news. The Walker family had been murdered. When Elbert arrived at the Walker home, he acted as if he had just heard the news for the first time. He sobbed uncontrollably, leaning over the hood of Christine's parked car, burying his head in his arms. In September of 1962, investigators revisited their focus on Elbert, tracking him down in Ridgely, Tennessee, where he was working as a migrant farm worker. They first spoke with Elbert's 17-year-old girlfriend, Johnny Rainey, and her brother. They revealed that although Elbert often talked about the rest of the Walker family, he had never mentioned Christine. Johnny said that Elbert appeared visibly disturbed when he talked about Cliff, while her brother noted that Elbert was crying like a baby as he spoke about Debbie, Cliff's daughter, being drowned in the bathtub. Elbert had even told him that Jimmy, Cliff's son, didn't die immediately because he crawled up to his daddy and died. This detail raised eyebrows among investigators, as there were no reports mentioning Jimmy crawling, only that he had died huddled next to his father. Elbert was questioned and hooked up to a polygraph machine, which he passed. However, in 1987, Lieutenant Max Skeens, the polygraph expert for the sheriff's office, expressed doubts about the reliability of old polygraphs. He explained that technology had significantly improved since then, and training back in the day was often minimal. During a meeting about the Walker case, detectives brought in Ellis Denham, an expert who had dedicated much of his career to solving the case. They asked him who his top suspect had been before he retired in 1975. Without hesitation, Denham replied, "Elbert Walker." After this revelation, detectives brought Elbert to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office and connected him to the latest polygraph machine. Once again, Elbert passed the test, and Lieutenant Dario Valente, who was part of the investigation, concluded in his report that Elbert Walker is not responsible for the Walker murders. He added that Elbert had been extremely cooperative and appreciated the ongoing concern regarding the investigation. Despite passing the polygraph tests and maintaining his innocence, Valente noted that this wouldn't be the last time Elbert would be questioned about the murders. 15 years from now, somebody is going to come along and probably do everything that we did all over again, Valente predicted. Next, we have Butch Dennison. A woman came forward to the police and claimed that Dennison had boasted about killing the Walkers. According to her, he said his father helped him cover it up by burying his cowboy boots, which allegedly had blood from the Walkers on them. Butch's father passed a polygraph exam. However, there is no indication that Butch was ever questioned in relation to the Walker murders. Then there's the meter reader, Stanley Mock. Stanley Mock left his Brinks Avenue home to read meters for the electric company. He exchanged pleasantries with some families whose homes were on his route and played golf in his spare time. But a troubled mind lurked behind his everyman exterior. Before the Walker murders, he enlisted the help of a psychiatrist to quash an uncontrollable urge to kill his wife and 2 small children. From the beginning of the Walker investigation, detectives were drawn to Stanley, eager to solve the case. They discovered he had also been linked to another mysterious crime that had occurred a few months earlier. A young University of Florida student named Chandler Steffens had been found dead in his apartment, tied up, tortured, and left for dead in a gruesome scene that became known as the Mummy Murder. As the detectives dug deeper, they learned that Stanley's meter route included the very apartment complex where Steffens had lived. The coincidences piled up when they found out he also read the meter for the Walker house. Yet, despite the unsettling connections, investigators never uncovered any concrete evidence to link him to either crime. In a recent interview, Mary Mock, Stanley's widow, revealed how her husband had been deeply affected by the Walker family's deaths. He had known the children and felt a special bond with them during his meter readings. The news of their brutal murder shattered him. When he saw it in the paper in 1959, it just about killed him, she recalled, explaining how he would often wander the streets at night, overcome with grief. Following the murders, Stanley suffered a complete breakdown and underwent electroshock therapy. His fear of hurting his own family haunted him, leaving him anxious and shaken during his work. Though Mary never knew her husband had been considered a suspect in the Walker case, she firmly believed in his innocence. "I'm positive, in my heart, he could never do something like that," she said, defending the man she knew and loved. There are also reports suggesting that a man named Emmett Monroe Spencer confessed to the murders of the Walker family. However, Sarasota County Sheriff Ross Boyer quickly discredited Spencer's confession, labeling him a pathological liar. The sheriff revealed that Spencer's claims were not genuine. Instead, they appeared to be cleverly constructed from real murders he had read about in newspapers and true crime novels he enjoyed. In an intriguing twist, in 1994, a bartender from Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, reached out to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office with a tip. She claimed that one of her customers had boasted about killing the Walker family. Unfortunately, this lead was never verified, and to this day the case remains open. However, perhaps the most infamous figures potentially connected to this tragedy are Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, the notorious duo involved in the Clutter family murders, which gained significant attention in Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood. If you've read this gripping book, you might remember a part that connects to the Walker family, highlighting eerie similarities between the two cases. The Clutter family was brutally killed by Hickok and Smith in Holcomb, Kansas in 1959, just 34 days before the Walker family met a similar fate. If you want to dive deeper into the details of this case, we have another video on it, and the link will be in the description box below. What ties these two cases together is that, after killing the Clutter family, Smith and Hickok escaped to Florida in a stolen car. They were spotted at least a dozen times between Tallahassee and Miami. The pair checked into a motel in Miami Beach, about 4 hours away from Osprey, and left the morning of the Walker murders. On that same day, they shopped at a department store in Sarasota, just a few miles from the Walker home. One witness noted that the taller man had a scratched face. The duo was arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada on December 30, 1959, for the Clutter murders, and they were executed by hanging on April 14, 1965. Although a polygraph test seemed to clear them of the Walker murders, some experts argue that the machines from the early 60s were often unreliable. The sheriff's office acknowledged that Hickok and Smith were considered suspects as early as 1960. Records show that the Walkers were looking to buy a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air, which matched the stolen car that Smith and Hickok were using in Florida. This raises the possibility that they entered the Walker home under the pretense of selling the car. In December 2012, investigators in Sarasota County announced plans to exhume the bodies of Smith and Hickok from Mount Muncie Cemetery. They hoped to extract mitochondrial DNA from the bones to compare with semen found at the Walker home. The bodies were exhumed, and DNA was collected. Kansas authorities stated they would prioritize processing the DNA from active cases, which could take weeks or even months. By August 2013, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office announced that they found no match between the DNA of either Perry Smith or Richard Hickok and the samples from the Walker murder. Only partial DNA was retrieved, possibly due to degradation or contamination over the years, leaving the outcome uncertain. Therefore, Smith and Hickok remain the prime suspects. However, based on the stolen items, Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist, believes it's unlikely they were the killers and suspects, that the murderer knew at least one member of the Walker family. With all that being said, it seems like a crazy coincidence that these two notorious family murders were in the exact same place at the same time. But then, if you consider the personal items that went missing, like the marriage certificate and Christine's drum uniform, it makes no sense for a stranger to want these items unless they were taken as trophies. Yet they weren't found on Hickok and Smith when they were arrested. If you're interested in checking out the Clutter family case, click the link on screen now. But what do you think? Who are the suspects that seem closer to you? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you once again for watching.